War has a way of shaping children into shadows of soldiers. In the collapse of Nazi Germany, boys who should have been chasing soccer balls instead held rifles taller than themselves. They were Hitler youth molded by fear, propaganda, and a desperate Reich that had run out of men. The spring of 1945 smelled of smoke and surrender. Towns lay shattered, streets littered with wreckage and whispers. In hidden pockets of countryside, young eyes filled with terror and stubborn duty. The boys believed every word their leaders had drilled into them. Americans were monsters. Americans killed without mercy. Americans would never take prisoners. So when the rumble of engines echoed through the trees and the stars and stripes appeared over the horizon, many of these children prepared to die. Tiny hands shook on cold triggers. Knees knocked beneath oversized uniforms. Hearts hammered stories of hate. But the Americans did not fire. They called out in gentle voices, urging the boys to drop their weapons. A strange calm poured across the battlefield. The children, trembling on the edge of life and death, found themselves confused. Why weren't they being shot? Instead of killing, the soldiers knelt. Instead of cruelty, they offered safety. And instead of hatred, they gave chocolate. Imagine that moment. A 12-year-old boy, starving, terrified, raised to believe he must fight until his last breath. Now staring at a hand offering chocolate like a peace treaty wrapped in foil. The sweetness must have tasted like waking from a nightmare. For the first time in years, some of these children cried. Tears streaked down faces hardened far too early by war. They were not warriors anymore. Just kids. Kids who wanted their mothers. Kids who wanted to be forgiven for the things war had forced them to do. In those fleeting exchanges, anger slipped away. Suspicion softened. And the world, for a heartbeat, remembered its humanity. These small acts did not erase the horrors. They did not undo the trauma etched into young hearts. But they planted something fragile and powerful. Hope. Hope that kindness could survive even the ugliest chapters of history. Hope that enemies could become humans again. Hope that even a child who once raised a rifle could learn to trust the hand that feeds him. This is a story not of battles, but of mercy. Not of conquest, but of compassion. A story of American soldiers who saw children, not adversaries. And German boys who, against everything they had been taught, dared to believe them. Beneath a bruised sky, in a village that looked more like a skeleton than a home, a group of boys sat huddled in a ruined barn. The war had stolen their names and replaced them with numbers, their innocence replaced by orders. They clutched rusted rifles and waited for the enemy they thought would slaughter them. Then footsteps approached. Not the stomping boots of SS officers who barked commands, but measured steps crunching carefully through broken hay and shattered glass. American soldiers. The boys squeezed their rifles tighter, breaths shallow and fast. One of them, Klaus, only 13, could feel his heartbeat pounding like artillery in his chest. His commander had told him that surrender meant torture, humiliation, death. Better to fall with a weapon in hand than be taken alive. He tried to make his trembling fingers obey the rifle's trigger. But before he could fire, an American sergeant raised his hands. Not in victory, in peace. "It's all right, son," the sergeant said softly. His voice didn't sound like a monster's roar. It sounded like a father calling his children home. Another soldier stepped forward. He set down his rifle and pulled something from his pocket. A small, foil-wrapped candy bar. He placed it gently on the ground between them, like a gift on an altar. The boys stared at it as if it were a trap. Then the chocolate was unwrapped, broken into pieces. A soldier slid one piece forward. Klaus's stomach ached with hunger. Hunger that gnawed like a wolf. Days had passed with nothing but crumbs. That chocolate was a miracle disguised as sugar. Slowly, shaking, he reached out. The American smiled. Klaus bit into the chocolate. The sweetness flooded his mouth, and the dam inside him burst. Tears he didn't know he still had spilled down his cheeks. Behind him, the other boys began to sob too, shoulders buckling under the sudden weight of being children again. One by one, rifles clattered to the earth. The soldiers helped them stand, dusted the dirt off their clothes. They wrapped blankets around thin shoulders. They spoke gently, letting the boys borrow their strength. For the first time since they'd been forced into uniforms, someone treated them like they mattered. Propaganda had painted Americans as beasts. But beasts don't kneel. Beasts don't feed their enemies. Beasts don't look into terrified young eyes and say, "You're safe now." War had given these boys every reason to expect cruelty. Humanity gave them a reason to hope. As they walked away from the front lines, leaving a battlefield that had almost become their grave, Klaus looked back at his discarded rifle, a symbol of fear, a burden he no longer wanted to carry. He understood something new. Sometimes the strongest soldier is the one who chooses not to fight. With rifles forgotten in the dirt and chocolate melting on their tongues, the boys followed their unlikely guardians out of the shattered barn. They were weak, but something invisible was keeping them upright. Hope has a way of making legs move even when bones feel like chalk. A few meters away, another squad of Americans stumbled upon two boys hiding behind the burned-out shell of a farmhouse. One was fierce-eyed, jaw clenched tight, determined not to show fear. The other trembled like a leaf in a storm. The fierce-eyed one, Emil, spat into the dirt. "You can't fool us," he snapped in ragged German. "You kill prisoners. Everyone knows." The American lieutenant knelt down, slow like someone approaching a frightened animal. He removed his helmet, revealing a head of sweaty hair flattened by worry more than war. "If we wanted to kill you," the lieutenant said gently, "we wouldn't be talking right now." Emil looked away, uncertain. His friend hid behind him, sobbing quietly. The lieutenant reached into his jacket and pulled out something shiny. "Dog tags." He placed them around Emil's neck. "Those belong to my little brother," he whispered. "He's 15, same as you. I want someone to take care of him if he ever ends up in a place like this." Emil's hardened expression cracked. A child suddenly stood where a soldier had been moments before. He looked at the tags like they were the most valuable thing in the world. Nearby, German villagers peeked from behind broken walls and shattered windows. Mothers clutched their starving children like shields against a future that felt like doom. One old woman stared at the Americans in disbelief. Her late-night whispers had always warned of demons draped in foreign flags. But these weren't demons. They were feeding children, treating them like long-lost sons. Her granddaughter tugged her sleeve. "Oma, they're smiling." The woman's throat tightened. She had forgotten what a smile looked like. One American soldier approached her with 2 cans of peaches, pressing them into her hands. The metal felt cold, but the gesture burned warm. "For your family," he said. "No sreds, no demands, just kindness." Tears gathered at the edges of her tired eyes. She bowed her head and whispered a word she never imagined she would say to the enemy. "Danke." The soldier nodded, tipping his helmet like a gentleman at a ballroom he never wanted to attend. This moment felt impossibly strange. The kind of moment that makes history pause, blinking in confusion. How could men trained to shoot become protectors? How could children trained to hate learn trust in a single afternoon? Yet there they stood. Enemies by command, humans by instinct. And that instinct was winning. The war was almost over. The killing was not yet finished. But in that small corner of a broken country, guns were no longer the loudest thing. Humanity was. The makeshift camp was quiet, almost eerily so. Not the silence of peace, but the hollow hush that follows a storm once everything worth screaming about has already been screamed. The boys sat near a crackling fire that smelled of damp wood and relief. Their uniforms were still technically German, but stripped of belts, badges, and the lies they used to carry. They were no longer soldiers. Not really. Just kids wearing costumes that war forced on them. Milo poked the fire with a stick, watching embers swirl upward like tiny meteors climbing into a night sky that didn't deserve to be so beautiful. He wasn't used to warmth. Cold had been the only consistent friend he'd known that winter. Next to him, Emil held those foreign dog tags like they were a lifeline. Every so often he'd grip them tight, as though checking they were real. A sergeant came by with a steaming pot of stew. He ladled it into tin cups for each boy. Milo's eyes widened. Potatoes, real chunks of them, and meat, not mystery shreds hidden in watery broth. Actual meat, the kind that filled your nose before it filled your stomach. He didn't wait for permission. He ate with the hunger of someone who hadn't truly lived until that moment. Flavor exploded in his mouth, and he nearly cried from the shock of it. Emil tried to hold on to dignity, eating slow, pretending he was above feeling grateful. But the second bite destroyed any pretense, and soon he was devouring just as fast. Across from them, an American soldier named Carter leaned against a crate, sharpening a pocket knife. He watched the boys with a curious softness, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like he'd found something precious in a place he expected only ugliness. "You boys sleep after this," Carter said. His German was rough but understandable. "You're safe tonight." Safe. The word felt unfamiliar, like a stranger knocking politely on the doors of their hearts. Milo looked around. Some Americans were smoking, some writing letters home, others cleaning rifles with distracted hands. But none were shouting, none were hitting, none were treating them as less than human. Emil swallowed the last mouthful and stared into the flames. Memory surged forward uninvited. His mother folding laundry by candlelight. His little sister laughing at a joke she didn't understand. Then the air raid sirens. The night the sky fell and his whole world burned. "How long do we stay here?" Emil asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Until someone decides what's next," Carter replied. "But tomorrow we march somewhere safer. Better food, too." Milo blinked. "Better than this?" The sergeant came back, this time with something small wrapped in wax paper. He dropped it into each boy's lap. Chocolate bars. Milo stared like he had just been handed a magic spell. He broke off a corner and tasted it. Sweetness rushed in, overwhelming his senses. He laughed, a sound he barely recognized coming from his own throat. Emil didn't eat his right away. He studied it, turned it over in his hand. Then he asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment they surrendered. "Why?" Carter paused his knife, lifted his eyes. "Why what? Why be kind?" Emil's voice cracked. "You could hate us. Everyone else does." The American set the knife aside. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "My brother is 15, he said. "He likes baseball, and strawberry milk, and getting into trouble when he says he's innocent." He nodded toward Emil. "He's just like you. Same age. Same scared look sometimes. And if this war had gone differently..." His eyes drifted somewhere only he could see. "Maybe he's the one sitting across this fire tonight." Emil didn't respond. He didn't need to. His hand moved instinctively to the dog tags around his neck, fingers tightening around them like a vow. The fire crackled, soft and alive. Somewhere in the distance, artillery echoed like thunder that hadn't yet realized the storm was ending. But for these boys, tonight was calm. A pause. A breathing space where fear loosened its claws. Where the enemy had a name, a face, and a heart. Where childhood, long buried beneath rubble and rifles, began to crawl back into their bones. Tomorrow would bring questions and marching and uncertain futures. But tonight, under blankets too big for their narrow shoulders, they finally slept. Not as soldiers, as children. Dawn arrived quietly, brushing pale gold across a countryside that had forgotten what gentle light looked like. The boys awoke wrapped in rough wool blankets that smelled of dust and safety. For a few seconds, they didn't remember where they were. The fire, the chocolate, the mercy. Then reality whispered in. They were still prisoners, but prisoners alive. The American camp stirred with the rhythm of routine. Boots laced tight, helmets strapped, trucks coughing to life like tired beasts waking from uneasy dreams. A sergeant moved through the area, checking that the teenage captives were ready to march. Milo rubbed his eyes, slow and reluctant. For the first time in months, sleep had not felt like a race against nightmares. He glanced at Emil, who was already awake and sitting upright, fingers curled protectively around the dog tags he'd been given. He didn't wear them like a trophy, more like a fragile promise. "Form up," Carter called, waving them and a handful of other young German prisoners into a small line. His voice wasn't harsh, more like a schoolteacher urging kids to hurry so they wouldn't miss the bus. One boy in line was even younger than Milo, 14 maybe. His boots were too big, every step swallowing his feet. He kept close to Milo like gravity pulled him there. Milo didn't push him away. "Where are we going?" the boy whispered. "Someplace safer," Milo answered, though he truly did not know. The words tasted hopeful, and hope was a flavor he was learning to like. The Americans handed each boy a slice of bread and a piece of fruit. Fruit, a luxury the war had stolen long ago. Milo bit into the apple and felt juice run down his chin. He wiped it quickly, embarrassed to be enjoying something too much. As the column began moving, the boys walked between two rows of American guards. Not herded, escorted. Emil studied the soldiers around them, some tired, some solemn, but none radiating cruelty. He'd expected kicks and curses. Instead, he heard laughter drifting from two men joking about home. "They're not watching us like wolves," Emil murmured. "Maybe wolves don't carry chocolate," Milo replied, attempting a smile. The road wound past ruins that once were homes. Windows had no glass. Bicycles lay twisted near doorsteps. A child's doll with a missing arm rested in the mud, abandoned mid-story. German civilians peeked out, gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes tracking the strange procession. The boys' faces burned with shame under those gazes. They weren't heroes returning home. They were reminders of promises broken by leaders who told them they'd be saviors of a nation. An old woman clutching a loaf of stale bread watched silently. She noticed the food in the boys' hands. Real food. Her eyes widened, not with anger, but confusion. Emil tried to look away. The dog tags clinked softly. The woman heard and made the sign of the cross. Not for herself. For him. A kindness she didn't know. They marched on. Hours passed, but the Americans never rushed them. When Milo stumbled, Carter steadied him. When the littlest boy limped, another soldier took his rifle and carried it for him, though it wasn't even loaded anymore. At midday, they stopped near a meadow alive with spring grass too stubborn to die under war's weight. The boys sat in the shade of a tree while the Americans passed around water. The littlest boy tilted his head back, staring at clouds drifting lazy and unhurried. "I forgot the sky could be this blue," he whispered. Emil followed his gaze. A sky clear enough to erase the memory of bomb smoke. For a moment, he let himself believe that life might continue under that sky. Not as soldiers, not as traitors to a collapsing empire, but simply as boys who wanted birthdays and summers and mothers who didn't cry at night. One American leaned close to Carter and spoke softly, thinking the boys couldn't understand. "They're just kids." Carter sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah," he answered. "War don't care about that, but we can." The words drifted across the grass, settling in Emil's chest like a seed he didn't dare touch yet. Soon the march resumed. The road bent toward a place the boys could not see. But one truth had already taken root. Not all captors are cruel. Not all enemies want to kill. And sometimes the greatest shock of war is discovering that the people you were taught to fear are the first ones to show you what it means to be human. As the column rounded a bend in the road, the calm rhythm of the march twisted suddenly into tension. Up ahead, a cluster of American soldiers stood around a lone figure sitting stiff-backed on the ground. His uniform was immaculate compared to the ragged teenagers. His posture straight, his boots polished, his eyes sharp and unbroken. A captured German officer. The boys felt a jolt of fear, like ghosts from the old world had caught up to them. Even stripped of power, a German officer carried the weight of authority that had shaped their entire young lives. Emil's steps slowed. His breath tightened. That uniform represented everything he had been told was noble, strong, unbeatable. The man wearing it now was none of those things, yet somehow his presence still demanded obedience. The officer's cold eyes swept the line of teenage captives. They widened just slightly when he realized how young they were. Barely soldiers at all. He barked a short command in German, Achtung! The boys' muscles reacted before their minds. They snapped to a rigid stance, spines iron straight, fists clenched at their sides. Old training drilled hard into frightened youth. Carter stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Emil's shoulder. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said quietly, but the officer's gaze sharpened into knives. "Stand properly, you disgraceful whelps," he hissed. "Have you forgotten your fatherland so quickly?" Milo flinched at the word. Fatherland. It used to feel heroic. Now it sounded like a lie someone told to steal children from their beds. One of the American guards approached the officer, nudging him to silence. But the man wasn't done. "You think these Americans will treat you with honor? You think you're safe?" He spat on the ground. "Fools. Cowards. Traitors to your people." Emil's heart pounded against his ribs. The dog tags around his neck felt heavier, like they were dragging him toward a choice he wasn't ready to make. He looked at the officer. This man had the voice of the Reich, but none of its promised glory. Just bitterness wearing decorations. "You taught us fear," Emil said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "They taught us something else." The officer's jaw clenched. His pride stung deeper than any bullet. "You are children," he growled. "You know nothing." Carter stepped between them, staring the officer down. "He knows enough," he said. "Enough to want to live." The officer scoffed. "Live? You think surrender is living? If Germany had men instead of boys, this war would be ours." Carter didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He just spoke the truth plainly. Germany sent its boys because the men were already dead. The words hit like artillery. The officer looked away, silence swallowing his anger. Not defeated by force, but by undeniable reality. The boys stood there, caught between two worlds, one collapsing behind them, another uncertain ahead. The officer stared into the distance, his eyes no longer filled with fire, only ashes. Emil turned toward the Americans and stepped back into the line. Milo followed. The other boys too. The officer called out one last time, desperation leaking into his voice. "You'll regret this." But none of them slowed. For the first time, the voice of authority sounded small, and the road toward the unknown felt bigger, brighter, even if the light was faint. The march continued, and with each step the boys took, the officers' shouts faded into a distant echo of a past losing its grip. They did not look back again. The gates of the POW camp rose from the horizon like a promise wrapped in barbed wire. Tall fences, rows of wooden barracks, guard towers that looked down with eyes that could not blink. The boys slowed as they approached, fear tightening its grip again. Prison. The word carried sharp edges. Dark stories, whispers of brutality traded in the barracks back home. But instead of barking orders and shoves, the Americans guided them forward with calm gestures and patient voices. A medic hurried over, not with accusations, but with a clipboard and a worried frown. He knelt in front of the youngest boy. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked, gently lifting the child's chin to check the bruises blooming there like unwanted flowers. The boy could barely speak. His voice was lost somewhere between hunger and disbelief. Inside the fenced grounds, rows of German prisoners stood waiting information. Not beaten, not starved, just there. Some had bandages. Some had cups of something warm. A few were laughing, soft but real. No calles. No screams. Just men waiting for the war to release its grip. Emil's heart stumbled over the sight. A sergeant with a clipboard checked their names, ages, units. His brows raised when he saw how young many of them were. He scribbled something with quick, angry strokes. Angry not at them. Angry at the adults who had sent them here wearing uniforms they were never meant to fill. A cook wheeled by a cart filled with steaming bowls of soup. The smell drifted over them like a warm blanket of disbelief. Milo stared. "This is a camp?" he whispered, voice cracking wide open. Emil swallowed. "It looks like people get to live here." The Americans separated the boys from the older prisoners, leading them to a newly built section with clean cots and extra blankets. A safe place for the youngest. Their own corner of mercy. As they entered the barack, Milo paused by the doorway, his gaze caught on something pinned to the wall. A painted sign. You are no longer soldiers. You are children. Rest. Milo didn't know whether to smile or cry. His chest felt too small for the feeling growing inside it. He turned his head and saw Carter again. The American stood in the doorway, arms crossed, exhaustion in his shoulders but pride in his eyes. You'll get food 3 times a day, Carter explained. School when you're ready. Letters home as soon as we can manage. You're safe until the war ends and someone figures out where home is. Home. The word was a ghost hovering over every bunk in that room. The boys set down their blankets, unsure what to do with comfort. Milo touched a pillow as if it might disappear. Emil sat stiffly, still gripping the dog tags, unwilling to let go of the bridge they represented. One by one, the boys sank into beds too soft for soldiers. Beds made for sons. Outside, the barbed wire glinted in the sun. It was still a prison. But inside, childhood began to thaw like spring creeping into frozen ground. A German officer from another part of the camp watched them through the mess hall window. He shook his head in baffled silence. These Americans, he muttered to no one. Strange people. They win and yet they choose kindness. Another prisoner replied, maybe that's why they win. Night fell not with fear, but with the gentle hush of boys drifting into dreams unbroken by mortar fire. Carter walked quietly past the window, glanced in one last time, then turned off the lantern to let the young faces sleep under a sky that finally allowed peace. For the first night in a long time, the war outside the fence stayed outside their hearts. A week passed inside the camp, measured not by artillery thunder but by mealtime bells and the slow return of hunger as a normal feeling instead of a fear. The boys learned routines. Roll call, breakfast, lessons in English taught by a patient chaplain, laughter in broken phrases. It felt surreal, like they had stepped sideways into a world where war existed only at the edges. Then a day arrived they did not expect. A day that carried both hope and terror in its hands. Mail call. Emil sat on his bunk, polishing the toe of his worn boot with his sleeve out of habit he couldn't shake. Milo sat beside him, bouncing his knee so fast the bed frame vibrated. The littlest boy clutched his blanket like a shield against disappointment. An American corporal stepped inside with a small canvas bag, clearing his throat. Letters for some of you, he announced. Every young spine straightened. The corporal began reading names, stumbling over German sounds. Each name was a spark, a breath held, a pulse skipping a beat. Then,
Emil Richter.
The world paused. Emil didn't move at first. His body forgot the mechanics of standing. Carter gently nudged his shoulder. That's you, kid. Emil rose on trembling legs and walked to the front like he was approaching a firing squad. The corporal handed him a thin envelope worn at the edges, smudged with fingerprints and hope. His name, written in his mother's looping script, nearly stole the air from his lungs. Danke, he whispered, and retreated to his bunk. For a long moment he just stared at the letter, afraid that opening it might destroy the fragile miracle in his hands. Milo watched, barely breathing. Read it, Milo urged softly. Emil inhaled deeply and slid a finger under the seal. The paper crackled like a voice clearing its throat after too many days of silence. My dear Emil. The first line struck harder than any shell that ever fell. His mother was alive. You have been in my every prayer. We were told you were fighting for our home. I pray still that your heart remains kind. Your sister asks for you every night. She sleeps holding your photograph so you will not be cold. Emil's vision blurred. He pressed the letter to his lips, fighting the sudden urge to sob into it. His sister. He could picture her tiny hands hugging that faded picture tight, the way she used to wrap her arms around his neck when she was half asleep. Milo placed a steady hand on his back. No words needed. Across the barack, another name was called. Milo Weber. Milo nearly fell off the bunk in surprise. He scrambled forward, grabbing his own envelope with shaking fingers. He opened it eagerly, breath catching in his throat as he found multiple pages inside. Not from his father, who had been gone for months. Not from neighbors lost to relocation. This was from his older brother. Milo, you stubborn runt. I heard rumors boys were being grabbed for the front and I feared the worst. Then I learned you were taken prisoner. I never thought captivity would bring me relief. But here I am, thanking God you're not buried under snow. Milo laughed and cried at the same time, sound cracking like ice under unexpected sunshine. The corporal continued reading names. One boy received news his village was still standing. Another learned his grandmother was searching for him. Even those who didn't get letters watched with smiles that hurt their cheeks, happiness radiating like shared warmth in a cold room. Then the corporal reached the bottom of the bag. He hesitated, eyes scanning the list one more time. That's all for today, he said, voice softer now. A silence fell across the room. Not everyone had been called. Hearts twisted with disappointment. But even those left empty-handed seemed lighter than before. If letters could find some of them, maybe hope wasn't done traveling yet. Carter stepped inside, leaning against the doorway with a tired but honest smile. Good news, he said. Tomorrow more mail arrives, and we're working to find every one of your families. That's a promise. Emil tucked his letter close to his chest and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The words written by his mother kept repeating in his mind. Stay kind. He wondered if she would believe how kindness had found him here, among those he once feared. Milo hugged his own letter like a secret treasure. His eyes shone with something he thought he had forgotten. Tomorrow. The word used to be a threat. Now it sounded like a beginning. As night settled over the camp, the boys fell asleep holding paper and ink like lifelines. Hearts no longer numb. Futures no longer blank. War had tried to make them soldiers, but letters from home reminded them who they really were. Sons, brothers, children not yet finished with the world. And somewhere beyond the fences, spring waited with green hands, ready to rebuild everything winter tried to take away. The boys sat in a quiet row along the edge of the forest clearing, helmets too big for their still-growing heads. Some of them were barely old enough to shave, and others had only just left childhood behind. Their uniforms clung loosely to bodies thinned by ration cuts and long marches. They kept their gaze low, wary of every crunch of boots approaching through the grass. They expected shouting, kicks, maybe worse. Instead, the Americans came bearing food. A soldier with kind eyes knelt before one shaking teenager and offered something wrapped in shiny foil. The boy flinched, waiting for the trick, the slap, the punishment. But the man simply smiled, nudging the chocolate closer, as if offering a truce in a universal language. Slowly, the boy took it. The chocolate softened against his tongue, melting into a burst of sweetness he had never tasted before. His eyes blinked wide, as though sugar itself were a miracle. Another soldier handed out canned peaches, bread soft enough to tear with fingers, chewing gum that snapped with flavor. Or replaced fear. Hunger replaced suspicion. For the first time in months, their worlds were not collapsing. They stole glances at the Americans, trying to reconcile these gentle hands with the monsters they were told would come. One boy whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. They don't hate us. No one answered. No one needed to. The war that had promised them glory had instead taken their youth. But in this moment, the enemy gave them back their humanity. Some German boys cried, silently, ashamed of their tears, yet unable to stop them. The Americans pretended not to notice, letting dignity stay intact. A sergeant looked at the group, exhaling a quiet sigh that held the exhaustion of 1,000 battles. They're just kids. His voice wasn't angry, just sad. The boys were still technically prisoners. The war was still raging in pockets far away. But here, beneath the spring sun warming the broken earth, the fighting was over. Just for them. Just for now. Bread, chocolate, and kindness became the first bricks in rebuilding trust after a world set ablaze. History often remembers wars through battles, explosions, and strategy. Yet sometimes the most enduring victories come in small, defiant acts of compassion. Ones that say, the future can be different. Because in the end, those young soldiers never forgot the day their enemies treated them like human beings again. And that memory, soft as chocolate and warm as bread, lived longer than the war ever did. In the final act of a war that consumed nations, these boys had been promised honor, purpose, a place in the pages of victory. Instead, they found themselves starving, abandoned by the very cause that demanded their youth. Yet when the world around them preached hate, the men they were told to fear extended mercy instead of vengeance. A shared meal, a soft gesture, a moment of humanity beneath the weight of history. These small acts did not erase the horror that came before. They did not rebuild the lives already shattered. But they planted seeds. Seeds of understanding. Seeds of compassion. Seeds that one day would grow into reconciliation between former enemies. For those young German soldiers, the war ended not with gunfire, not with surrender, but with chocolate in their hands and kindness they had never expected. It is said that wars are fought by soldiers, but peace is built by people. And sometimes, peace begins with the simple realization that the enemy was never so different after all.